why is Jacob hesitant to go to Egypt? And how does God respond? I mean, just for a second, think about everything that Jacob has gone through in his life, what he's been taught, what he's seen, what he's witnessed, what he's experienced, his highs and his lows, and the famine that they're going through. So why is Jacob hesitant to go to Egypt? Yeah. He's old, he's tired, he doesn't want to go. He knows this is the land of promise. I mean, he's been told by his dad and his granddad that this is the land of promise. And all of a sudden, the food's in Egypt and his son's in Egypt. And he's being told to go to Egypt for food. And he's like, what's going on? Like his world's coming crashing to down. And to pick up everything he owns and get in a U-Haul and go, that's hard. And so he sets out with all that he had and came to Beersheba. Have we seen Beersheba before? Yeah, that's popped up several times in this Genesis story. What happened at Beersheba maybe that we can remember from past studies, from our past classes? What are some major events that happened there? I'm going to place a marker and pull up a couple. Genesis 26 is one of them. There in Genesis chapter 26, so this is going a little while back in the story. Genesis 26, Isaac goes up from Beersheba, or up to Beersheba, where the Lord appeared to him at night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your offspring because of my servant Abraham. Now, as Isaac set out with all that he had and comes to Beersheba, what does God say to Israel, to Jacob? Well, that night when he's at Beersheba, Jacob, Jacob, he said. And Jacob replied, here I am. I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you back. And Joseph will close your eyes when you die. Yeah.
I think it's true that Abraham went to Egypt twice on sanctioned visits.
Yeah. 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 That's a great point that, for you look at the family history, probably some stories have been passed down, and we all have stories in our family about things that our family has gone through, and those stories have maybe shaped us in some way. And so he knows some of the stories of what happens and the mistakes that his family has made there in Egypt. And he's like, wait a second here, this has never turned out good for our family when we go down to Egypt. So we need some reassurance. That's a great point there. Yeah, Craig?
God promised him the land of Canaan.
Yeah.
And so now he's an old man. He knows
Yeah. Yeah. He knows the promise. This is the land. This is where God is going to make us a great nation. This is where God is going to give the descendants of my descendants. And yet, huh? That's hard to leave everything you have. And so Jacob left Beersheba, and the sons of Israel took their father in the wagons Pharaoh had sent to carry him, along with their dependents and their wives, and everything they're taking with them, all of them. And then right there in the middle of this story about them going to Egypt, we get a list of names. Now, is anybody in here a genealogy guy? Like where you love getting up on, looking up your family history? Because I'm a history geek, I love it. So I love genealogies. I'm a little weird. I get it. But genealogies are fun, and genealogies in the Bible are super important. The names are in there for a reason. They're telling us about Jacob's family and how they are already within his lifetime being fruitful and multiply. Jacob and his 2 wives and his 2 concubines have now multiplied into 12 kids with all of their kids. And there's a total of 70 people going down. Is the number 70 significant in the Genesis story or in the biblical story? Can you think of another time in the Genesis story where we see a number 70? Yeah, 70 elders with Moses. There's another time specifically in Genesis. Genesis chapter 10. There's a flood. The world is wiped clean. And in Genesis chapter 10, there is what your Bible may have a heading over it called the Table of Nations or something similar. And if I'm not mistaken, there are 70 names recorded in that Table of Nations, explaining, as we've talked about in previous classes, where all these nations are coming from or have come from. That is, Israel is being formed and transformed and becoming the people of God and learning about their God and learning about their history, who these people they're conquering and who these people they're interacting with. There's this list of names there in Genesis chapter 10. And there's 70 names in them. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I think we usually call that maybe the limited commission or the sending of the 70. That's a great one there in the New Testament. So that we see this number 70 pop up a time or 2 or 3 in the Bible. So that's really interesting that you see 70 names go down to Egypt. And so what we are seeing in the Genesis story, if we can just zoom out for a second, is the Genesis story begins, Genesis 1 through 11, where? Where's Genesis 1 through 11 largely set? In what part of the world? You can even name the modern nation if you know where it is. Modern day Iraq, Mesopotamia, you may have learned about that in geography in school. It's set there. Genesis 46 through 50 is set largely in Egypt. Genesis 12 through 45 is set where? Largely in the Promised Land, with a couple of escapades to Egypt and stories about, people going back to Mesopotamia. And so for the most part, this Genesis story begins and ends outside the Promised Land. And so that's where we are here in the Genesis story. And so they travel, they get to Egypt. Judah gets there and he meets his dad and he weeps for a long time. What a reunion that must have been. For decades, Jacob thought his son, his favorite son, was dead. And in recent years, he's found out that his son may be alive. Maybe a part of him doesn't want to believe it. But to see his son in the flesh, and he weeps for a long time, and he's like, verse 30, look at this, I'm ready to die now because I've seen your face, and you are still alive. And so he tells his family to go to Goshen, which is in the northeast end of the Nile Delta. And it gives them a place where they can live by themselves. Because as the text tells us, the shepherds are detestable to Egyptians. Egyptians were a very proud people. They didn't like shepherds. So they get their own land, their own area where they can multiply and they can live in isolation without influence from the Egyptian gods. They can kind of become their own people with minimal, because we've seen already in this story about the Canaanites mixing in from time to time and the influence they bring. And as we saw a couple of weeks ago in Judah's family and how he married Canaanite women and the trouble that it caused in his family with his 2 sons being exceedingly wicked to the point God puts them to death. And so living in Goshen kind of gave them a chance to be themselves. And here's just a really cool note as we think about this. that if you go to that area of the world today, in the Nile Delta, and you start digging in the dirt, and you start doing the archaeology that, the Indiana Joneses of the world, the real guys do, they actually find evidence of Semitic people there in the Nile Delta. There's obviously not a stone that they've found yet that says, Jacob was here, but there's evidence of Semitic peoples there in the Nile Delta, dating to roughly what they believe to be roughly this time. Anyway, so they get down to Egypt there in chapter 46. Pharaoh welcomes Joseph and Jacob. And here's something that I find interesting. At this point in time in ancient history, Egypt was one of the world powers, if not the world power. But look at verse 7. Chapter 47 verse 7. Joseph then brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And in verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Does that strike you for any reason? Does that jump out to you for any reason? In the ancient world, who blessed who? Did the greater bless the lesser, or the lesser bless the greater? Yeah, the greater bless the lesser. Who's doing the blessing? It's Jacob, not Pharaoh. Which is interesting, because it says something perhaps about Jacob and how Pharaoh viewed Jacob, perhaps because of his age, because Jacob was an older, wiser man, and in the ancient world, older, wiser men were highly respected, as they should be. But perhaps there was a part of him that recognizes there's something special about this guy. But also, let's think about the Genesis story specifically. What did God tell Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12? When he made that first promise all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, that first conversation that God and Pharaoh, or God and Abraham have. Place a bookmark and go back to Genesis chapter 12. The very beginning of the story of the patriarchs there in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord speaks to Abraham and tells him to go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And that's going to be key for the Exodus story, by the way, and it will start in a few weeks. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. What are we seeing at this point in the Genesis story? Who is being blessed at this point? What has Joseph been doing for the entire world for the last couple of chapters? Feeding everyone. All the nations of the world are being blessed through Joseph, through Jacob. We're seeing that already, that this kind of develop. And we'll keep that idea in mind because we'll come back and loop back to it here in a couple of minutes. And then over time, we see there in Genesis chapter 47 that the land become Pharaoh, that because the famine gets really, really bad, people can't buy food and they start mortgaging and they start really basically giving their land to Pharaoh, where Pharaoh gets really powerful and they start basically paying a 20% tax on their crops to pay Pharaoh back. And they settle in Goshen. It's a reminder there in verse 27, 28, 29. But then in verse 30, chapter 47 and verse 30, this jumps out to me. When I rest with my ancestors, this is Jacob speaking. When I rest with my ancestors, carry me away from Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And Joseph answered, I will do what you have asked. And Jacob said, swear to me. And Joseph swore to him. Then Israel bowed in thanks at the head of his bed. Does that jump out to you? What have we seen Jacob do his entire life? I mean, we've been looking at Jacob for feels like a month now. Has Jacob been a guy who looks forward? No. Not usually. He's usually been a guy who's lived in the here and now. And right here, right now, we see Jacob becoming or being a guy who looks forward. A guy who trusts in the promises of God and everything that's going to happen. That's going to become more apparent here in a chapter or two. Does anybody have any questions on 46 and 47? Anything jump out to you in Genesis 46 and 47 that maybe we skipped over for time reasons? So there in chapter 48, Jacob begins to bless his family. And he starts there with Manasseh and Ephraim. Who are Manasseh and Ephraim? Joseph's sons. And so Jacob pulls his favorite son, not his oldest son, but his favorite son, and blesses his sons. And so I just want to read and pack a couple of things there. That Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, or Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make many nations come for you. And I will give this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. Your two sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simeon do. What is he doing with Joseph's sons? He's adopting them. He's for all intents and purposes, he is adopting Joseph's sons. He is telling Joseph, look, when it comes time to divvy up my stuff, your sons are going to be treated as my sons. It's an incredible honor for Joseph's sons there in the text. And he even goes on there later in the chapter, as he begins to bless them specifically. Pay attention to this. Verse 13, that Joseph took them both with his right hand on Ephraim toward Israel's left, and his left hand on Manasseh toward Israel's right, and brought them to Israel. But Israel stretched out his hand, his right hand, and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, put his left on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Have we seen that before? There are 4 generations straight, the older serves the younger. Where the younger gets the blessing, the younger gets the inheritance, the younger gets the favored position. And that's what we see here. I want us to pay attention here as he's blessing Joseph's sons there. And just listen there, starting in verse 15, to what Jacob says. And then compare it in your minds to what we saw from Jacob at the beginning of his life. Then he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my father Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow numerous within the land. Does anything jump out to you about this blessing that Jacob is bestowing upon Joseph's sons? Where did Jacob start? What kind of man was he? Was he an exceedingly righteous dude? No. Was he a guy that had a habit of thinking about God and giving credit to God, generally speaking? No. How many times do we see God referred to there in that blessing? And just, I think it's 2 verses. How many times does God pop out in this blessing? I see at least 3 times. maybe even 4, if you include the pronouns. The God before whom my fathers walked, the God who has been my shepherd, the angel who has redeemed me, may he bless these boys. Jacob, we started looking at him a month ago, and we had a lot of conversations for 2 or 3 weeks straight in here, some good questions, some honest questions, some heart-wrenching questions about Jacob's character and how he was a really vile and despicable dude. He lied, he cheated, he stealed, he was awful. Not a kind of guy you want your daughter bringing home. But now at the end of his life, his journey, his trials, his tribulations, everything that's happened to him has strengthened his faith to now he's at the point where he can say, this is all about God and what God has done for me. And so he blessed them there in chapter 48. And then in chapter 49, we read his last words, and he blesses all of his sons one by one. So I want to ask this question for us to kind of think about here. What stands out about Jacob's blessings in Genesis 48 and 49? What do you notice? Yeah. On paper, you're spot on. He's not the oldest son. He's the oldest son of his favorite wife, but he's not the older son. But he's the one who gets the double blessing, the double portion, because that's what the older son got in those days. I don't have to worry about that in my family. I am the older son. I am also the youngest son. I am the only son and have been the only son for 4 generations. So, what else? What else do you guys notice in these blessings? Yeah.
So Ephraim and Manasseh, they end up in the northern kingdom.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the two of them ends up on the right side of the Jordan River.
Yeah.
Neither of
Yes and no. Yeah. Yeah, so the big thing there, so let's kind of zoom back and look at the younger. Ephraim, the reason I answered that way, when you look at the divided kingdom, the northern kingdom is sometimes called by its entirety Ephraim. So it takes a larger place of prestige, a bigger place of prestige when the kingdom divides in 931 BC or thereabouts. You will see in the Old Testament, in the prophets and kings, those passages where you'll see a reference to Ephraim. That's why. That's a connection back here. Yeah, Chris.
What it says is, Manasseh will be great. The point of this is just that the one's going to serve the other.
Yeah.
That's the key component.
Yeah.
So that greatness, I think, is relative. I think the fact that Ephraim had the notoriety
Yeah.
in terms of the north is definitely, and I think it's the contrast that,
Yeah.
that strikes me.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So I would say, for me, I would kind of connect it to that moment in time when Ephraim takes the place of prestige as the primary namesake of the northern kingdom. Yes, they all kind of come under the Ephraim banner. That's my initial thought. I could be wrong. Anybody else have a better answer than that? What else stands out to you about these blessings? What about the blessing to Judah? There in verse, let me back up. Look at the blessing to Reuben. You are my firstborn, my strength, and the first fruit of my virility, excelling in prominence, excelling in power, turbulent as water. You will not excel, because you got into your father's bed and you defiled it. That sin that he had a couple chapters ago when he slept with his father's concubine, sin, actions have consequences. And now he doesn't get the place of prominence. Kevin is really, and I wish he was here because he's really kind of pointed out over the last couple of weeks. Oldest son's supposed to be the son of promise. Reuben loses it. because of the sin with the concubine. Simeon and Levi lose that favored position because of how they treated things after Dinah was raped and the issues with Shechem there. And so it goes all the way down to Judah, that the leader comes down to Judah there in verse 8. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's son will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until whose right it comes, or you may have until Shiloh comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. Who's that talking about? What is this promise all about? What's he saying? What's the near-term prophecy or blessing or result for Judah and his descendants? Jesus is the interim. That's where it's heading. Yeah, so that you're spot on. That I think this is anticipating or a prophecy about Jesus. But where do the kings come from? After Saul, who is from the tribe of Benjamin, where do the kings come from? Judah. That it would be Judah's right to rule. And you see with the United Kingdoms, David and Solomon from the tribe of Judah, and the southern kingdom and the divided kingdom all come from David. And even in the post-exilic period, after they go off into exile and they come back and they're establishing governors, you even see a Davidic leader in Ezra and Nehemiah play a prominent role in that story. Yes. Yes. So that's a great question. That's a really awesome question. So my inclination, my answer for that goes back to the question or their request there in 1 Samuel 8. We want a king like the nations. And so he pulls one from Benjamin. A guy who looks like a king, talks like a king, acts like a king, walks like a king, everything you would expect a king does. And if you really look within Saul's story, not just what we've looked at on our Sunday morning sermons, but look at even going back to the story of the judges and the hints it's saying along the way where Saul is from and his hometown, Benjamin is never connected with good. It's never an absolute, rarely connected to good. And so what it's telling us is Saul, which literally means the one you request. So the one they've requested is to be like the nations. He's a wicked guy. Everything it tells us about Saul from the very beginning of the story is this is not a good dude. And so God is giving them what they want in order to set them up for what they need. And that's David. And so really, if you can look at the story of Judges and Samuel, it's really a search for a godly king. If you really kind of zoom out and look at those 2 books, 3 books, 2 books in the Hebrew Bible, I think, and 3 books in the English Bible, there are some really common themes throughout their story, and they all kind of connect and kind of point to that overarching theme of the king after God's own heart. And that would be David from the tribe of Judah that would establish that line of kings back to Genesis 49. That makes sense? What other things jump out to you guys here in the blessings? Is that a hand raise or is that just... Okay. Go. Yeah. Into his family. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So Levi, that's a great point as we look forward to the conquest and the establishment of the kingdom and the division of the land. Levi gets cities as opposed to entire territories. They get their Levitical stuff. So my gut is this is another time, and that's a great question. My gut says it's probably tied through to Jacob probably playing a little bit of favorites again and setting things up. But I could be completely wrong on why, because it doesn't make sense.
Well, it could be a legitimacy thing too.
Yeah.
These were kids who were raised in,
Yeah.
and so he is endorsing them as part
That's a
of
great
the
point. Yes, that is a great point because everybody else has been born pretty much in the promised land, or if not in the promised land, in the same vicinity, in the same tents together, and all of a sudden you're welcoming in these outsiders. What are you going to do with these two kids? That's a great point. Two people who've been born in Egypt. We've been told these people are foreigners, and remember, they're half Egyptian. That Joseph marries an Egyptian, the daughter of an Egyptian priestess. So what are we going to do with this? That's a great point. What else do you guys see? You see anything else in the blessings that jumps out to you?
Well, this is a pivotal moment in setting up the rest of the Old Testament. It really does set up the growth of the nation, the exodus that follows that, the entrance back into the promised land where they take it. I mean, everything, and then the kingly structure. So this blessing thread is incredibly important to the rest of the narrative.
Yes, and to kind of build on what you said, I've already kind of started diving into Exodus a little bit over the last couple of days, and I came across somebody who said that Exodus begins in Genesis, and that I never heard it put that way. But if you look at the first 7 or so verses of Exodus, it's Genesis all over again. That the last couple of chapters in Genesis, in the first 7 verses or so of Exodus, really are really closely thematically tied together. Yeah.
Well, this also, I mean, this going to Goshen secured the purity of the people and their lineage. We've already seen intermarriage and other things happening with those people. This isolates.
Yes.
For 400 years, these 12 in their current state and their families to then grow within that and become this culture unto themselves that would never have happened, and it actually alludes to that, it even says that earlier in Genesis, that they needed to extract themselves from that land at that time and then go back to that so that they could come back as Israel.
Yes. I'm glad you're catching those themes there. There's a lot there. We'll talk about more about Exodus 1 through 7. Today's Wednesday, so next Wednesday, and we'll dig into that because we're going to dive into, I think, Exodus 1 and 2 a week from today. But these blessings are really super important. And so really, I want to go ahead to the end of the chapter to Jacob's burial instructions. And again, as we read this and what Moses is telling us here in the text, think about the Jacob we met, the Jacob we've seen, the Jacob we've walked with, and what Jacob says here. Look at verse 29. Then he commanded them, I am about to be gathered to my people. In other words, I am about to die. Bury me with my ancestors in the cave in the field of Ephraim the Hethite. The cave is in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. We've seen that location pop up a time or two. This is the field that Abraham purchased from Ephraim the Hethite as a burial property. Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there. And I buried Leah there. Who's the favorite wife? Where is Rachel buried? What? Near Bethlehem. Where is Jacob saying, bury me? Not next to my favorite wife. Bury me next to Leah. Okay. Now let's start unpacking that. Who is the Jacob that we met earlier, going several weeks ago, several chapters ago? Would the Jacob we first met say this? No. The Jacob we first met, when he woke up the next day and he found out he was married to the wrong woman, got angry. And now at the end of his life, he says, bury me next to the wrong woman. That's interesting. That Jacob has grown. Jacob has transformed. These journeys, I know we've talked about it tonight a couple of times, but I know I'm emphasizing this for a reason. I've hinted at it for the last couple of weeks. That Jacob is a scumbag. Let's just call it like it is. But Jacob grows. And we love to give the patriarchs a hard time for all their failures and all their shortcomings. And they probably deserve it. But Jacob grows. And I think there's a lot we can see in Jacob's story that is actually our story. Because for so often for us, from a matter of application, we don't always get things the first time. That we have struggles, we have doubts, we sin, we fall, we manipulate, we do all these terrible things. But in the process, we're growing. And we're growing in faith. My guess is for a lot of you, you're thinking of someone, maybe it's you, maybe it's someone in your family, maybe it's a friend, who obeyed the gospel, but even after they became a Christian was still not that great of a person. And then somewhere along the line, the light bulb went off. And they are a completely different person. Maybe they used to cuss, maybe whatever it was. And whatever sin, whatever problem, whatever struggle they had, you now run into them 20 years later, and it's just like, who are you and what have you done with my friend? What have you done with my family member? They're completely transformed. That's, I think, Jacob's story. Yeah.
I kind of think that's the point, though. Gosh, man, who is good? No one's good with the problem. We deal with what we have in terms of things. God's got his own pacing. God's got his own time. People have their own struggles all along the way. We're here to pray and help. The whole good bad thing doesn't really float with me as I've gotten older. I think there's a propensity to, and I've quoted Dan May before, but you're never sinless, but hopefully you're sinning less.
Yeah.
And I think that's true.
Yeah.
But it's like still tempted by stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense of arrogance that we can have if we somehow think, oh, okay, well, these are the good guys. Because that's the people we teach, right? We're
Yeah.
the good people.
Yeah.
Oh, man, they're going to be Christians because they're the good people.
Yeah.
No, they're not. Not if they don't realize they need God.
Yeah.
And so I think God gives us these rich, deeply flawed people through history to say it's never been about them other than their willingness to serve.
Yeah.
And that's what gives us hope. That's why the people of faith are people of faith.
Yeah.
Because of all these bad situations and bad decisions and everything else, but what did they have that one thing in common? They trusted in God, even through it all. And I just think I have hopefully learned as I've gotten older to appreciate that more. And that then gives me patience with those around me and with myself because I'm not trusting myself anymore.
There is, I think, as we're reading about these characters in Genesis that we've spent the last 3 months on. I had to remember what month of the year it was. A real lesson for us in Ephesians 2:8. Ephesians 2:8, we are saved by grace through faith. there is nothing remarkable about these guys. But there is something remarkable about our God. And one of the key themes that we see over and over in their story is God's amazing grace to work through or in spite of their sins and their failures. But we also see their faith in these great moments of incredible faith where these people step out and explain or demonstrate their trust in God. And that's us. So when we look at like Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, that's not a new revelation to Paul per se. It's what God has been doing since Genesis 1. We've just sometimes missed it in the biblical story. And I just love the fact that you see it so much in Jacob's character development. If I can use kind of a movie term, his story, his arc is just so obviously transformational as grace and faith come together in him, and he becomes really a completely different person. And not only that, you have the guy who lived for the here and now is telling his family, take me back home. Not just because that's where his ancestors were buried and that's what you did in that day and that time. And to be honest, I'll tell you guys, I've had some conversations with my family in recent weeks after Josh lost his wife. And occasionally I have this conversation with my parents and say, look, if something happens to me, bury me home in Tennessee. That my family, my grandfather and my parents and her siblings, there's a plot of land lined up there in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where we're all buried. I said, bury me as close to that as possible. Not that that really matters or anything like that. But it was a big deal in the ancient world. It's a big deal for me. But I think there's something else different here, more specifically, that he asked to be buried back in Canaan, not just with his ancestors, because that's where the future lay. That's where his hope lay. That's just interesting. And so just for a moment, we've thought about this and we've danced around it, but what are some differences between the Jacob we first met and the Jacob we see now? What are some things that strike you about the Jacob we met and the Jacob we see now? Yeah, Craig? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He tried to take control. What's he doing now? He's leaving it up to God. What else do you guys see in his development? We talked about he lived for the now he's looking to the future. What else? Do you see anything else? Am I the only one here who is struck and surprised by the fact that Jacob asked to be buried with Leah? I mean, he had 3 other women he could be buried with. Am I the only one who's struck by that? Surprised by that? I think that shows part of that character development, that story arc that we've talked about already. Jacob is a completely different person because of his walk in faith with God and God's grace. Yeah. 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 Certainly there's probably an aspect that once you got rid of the sister wives aspect, maybe there was a greater appreciation for Leah and what she offered as a person. There, in fact, there's hints in earlier chapters that Leah may have been more spiritually minded than Rachel. That's just hints, not necessarily coming out directly saying it, I don't think, but it's hinted. And maybe Leah's influence, I keep saying Leah. The force is strong with me tonight, I guess. Anyways, and so Jacob dies. his story comes to an end. His story has really dominated the last half of Genesis. And his story comes to an end there in verse 33, and he dies. And he is end up buried. Chapter 50 tells us that he is buried over in Canaan, in the land where he requested to be buried. That Joseph talks to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh supports him and gives him all the honors that you would expect for a man like Jacob in the ancient world. But then I want to close up with the end of the chapter. Where Joseph's brothers look and saw their father was dead. And they said to one another, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. They're like, uh-oh. The gloves are off. We know what we did decades ago, and he was nice to us because he wanted to keep the peace and make Daddy happy. Daddy's gone. We're in trouble. So they send a message in verse 16. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph. Please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin and the suffering they caused you. And therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when he heard. His brothers also came to him and bowed down before him and said, we are your slaves. Does any of this jump out to you? Why? Why do these two verses why are these like flashing neon lights for the Genesis story? There was a vision when? Yeah, Genesis chapter 37. What was that vision about? They were going to be bowing down to him. And now what do we see? They're bowing down to him. Not for the first time, not for the second time, but for the third time in the story. Joseph's brothers bow down to him. The vision, those dreams have come true. So I want us to think about, I may have already answered this, but how did Joseph and his brothers respond to Jacob's death? They come within the two verses, please forgive. Don't do anything to us. But what else happens there in the story? What is Joseph? How does Joseph? Yeah.
So Joseph said that God's plan from the beginning.
Yeah.
So he's not.
That's interesting. For a lot of different reasons. Joseph's father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, they all had visions or conversations with God. I can't think of a time in Genesis 37 through 50 where Joseph has a one-on-one conversation with God. In fact, for the most part, for a couple of decades, he's been away from the promised land. He's had the dreams, but yeah, and so there's the dreams of Genesis 37, but God communicates to Joseph differently than he communicates to the other patriarchs, I guess is my point. And somewhere along the way, Joseph has learned one thing. Verse 19, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Jacob's number 2 in Egypt. He could say, I'm going to kill all of you guys. But I'm not in the place of God. And this is really cool, interesting. What happened there in Genesis chapter 3? What did Adam and Eve try to do in the garden? Draw even with God. What is Joseph doing here in the text? I'm not God. Keep that in mind for the next question. You planned evil for me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Joseph, this is something else to keep in mind for the next question. Joseph is willing to suffer redemptively so that others may live. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. He realizes that his calling was missiological, that he brought about the salvation of many people. And so really quickly as we wrap up, I told you this question was coming last week. What parallels do we see between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ? He was there to save people. That's one. There's a lot of them. Probably not going to see all of them tonight. He was rejected, but exalted. He goes for, in another way of phrasing it, and maybe a little bit more poetically, he goes from prisoner to palace, is the way one book calls it. What other similarities? Yeah, he showed love and compassion, mercy to those who, that's an awesome one. Y'all see any other parallels between? There's probably some more there that we could break down, but we are approaching the end of our time together. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions on Genesis 46 through 50, or anything else you've picked up along the way? Yeah.
All these patriarchs,
Yeah.
when they know they're going to die, they lift their feet up from the ground into the couch and they die.
Yeah. Yes. I know my time has come. But, and a less humorous note, we look at that and we go, that's the way to go. Peacefully. But I wonder if they can die in peace. And this is purely theoretical, and I'm speculating here. I realize that. But I wonder if the reason they can die in peace is at the end of their life, they've come to live by faith in God. And I think that's why Hebrews 11 spends so much time on the patriarchs and emphasizing how they looked forward because of their faith. What else do you guys see there in the text? Yeah, Steve?
So, I've been sitting here this whole time trying to answer the question of Jacob and Leah.
Yeah.
Doesn't that strike you?
Yeah.
Leah was his first wife. I'm trying to figure out why that's not as it should have been.
And that may be the answer. He was his first wife. But you're wrestling with wife versus first love. And that's Rachel was the one he loved. Rachel's the one he worked 14 years for. Yeah. 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 There's tradition. No, that's and now my mind goes to what's the play Fiddler on the Roof, Tradition. So I've referenced Star Wars and Fiddler on the Roof. No, I think that's a fair, that may be it. Yeah, go ahead.
It's just interesting to me as we wrap up Genesis. We started off in Genesis in the beginning, and what did God tell Adam to do? To rule over the animals, to rule over the land. Adam, rule over this thing. That's the picture. Go forward, ruling over things.
Yeah.
And clear through Genesis, over one patriarch. This is a purely political thing. You don't have to answer. Whatever. But we're watching this pattern. This country invades that country. That country invades that country.
Yeah.
Cha-ching. Take the promised land. Go into Canaan. Take it over. That's the pattern all the way through all of the Old Testament is the weak, the strong are overtaking the weak.
Mm-hmm.
It's just all the way through it. And yet here we are sitting at a time in our country today when we feel like we've got to go back and make everything fair. Let's have, let's go back. We took this land was taken from those people. I understand this is a totally political thing, but I'm just saying somehow we're living at a time when we're trying to sort of take the place of the way that the order of things were set in motion. If we tried to go back in Genesis, at the end of Genesis, and fix everything that wasn't fair, it'd be impossible. And yet somehow, and I wonder if it isn't just because we're living at a time when people have so little concept of God that they're just constantly trying to make everything fair when there's nothing fair in life. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Well, there is a spiritual aspect of this, and here's what I think you're getting at. Nothing is fair in life because there's injustice in the world, and there's injustice in the world because of sin. And so long as there's sin in the world, we're going to deal with injustice, and we're going to deal with the results of sin throughout our world, whatever it looks like and whatever age we may live in, we're going to deal with it, whether it's Genesis or whether it's today. But that's not where I thought you were going. Because where does Genesis begin? You are spot on with that. With Adam being told, rule over creation, be fruitful and multiply. Where does Genesis end? God's people ruling in Egypt and being fruitful and multiplying. Interesting. There's some other stuff I have here on Joseph being almost like a new Adam or an anti-Adam in some aspects, which ties us back to Jesus, because what is Jesus sometimes referred to in the New Testament? As an Adam-like figure there, especially in Romans, if I'm not mistaken. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions? Okay, guys, I'm going to look for the clip at some point in the next couple of days and try to find it, because as much as I've loved doing this, we may end up ordering another one because it disappeared. But we'll try to not have to deal with this next week. But on that note, we'll dismiss, and we'll be in Exodus starting a week from today.